I left work early that day, my heart fluttering like a teenager's. It was our anniversary, and not just any date on the calendar. I wanted it to feel special. I made his favorite dinner, the roast that took hours but always made him smile. I opened our best wine, the one we kept for something meaningful, and I even polished the silverware he always said reminded him of his mother's house. The table looked perfect, simple, warm, intimate, just like I hoped our night would be. I stood back, took it all in, and felt this quiet pride swell in my chest. As I lit the last candle, I heard the familiar buzz of my phone on the kitchen counter. I smiled, instantly. It had to be Daniel. I imagined his message. Maybe something silly and sweet, like, "I'm bringing dessert, and it's me." That was his kind of humor. My hands moved quickly, eager to open it. I wanted to feel his words before I even read them. But the second I saw the first line, my body stopped. Every muscle tensed. My eyes scanned the screen again, not because I didn't understand, but because I couldn't believe it. "Pack your things and leave the house. You're no longer useful to me. I'm coming home with my new wife." That's what he wrote, on our anniversary. My vision blurred, and I wasn't sure if I was shaking from shock or from the sting of betrayal that sliced through me like a knife. The room, our home, suddenly felt cold, unfamiliar. I stared at the candles, still flickering, as if mocking me. But then something shifted inside me. The tears didn't fall. Not yet. Instead, a stillness took over. A quiet, seething rage that spread like frost across my chest. I kept reading it, again and again, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less cruel, less final. But no. Each time it was the same dagger. "You're no longer useful to me." As if I were some appliance that stopped working. As if the years I poured into that marriage, into him, had an expiration date he got to stamp. I backed away from the table like it had betrayed me too, like every plate and fork was in on the joke. My knees buckled a little, but I stayed upright. I had to. Because if I let myself fall, I wasn't sure I'd get back up. I walked through the house in a daze, my hands brushing over the life we'd built. The couch we picked out after a dozen furniture stores, the painting from our trip to Santa Fe, the rug his mother gave us when we bought the place. Every corner held a memory. And now, all of it felt tainted, contaminated by his choice. I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror, the same one I'd checked earlier, fixing my lipstick like a fool. My face was pale now, my eyes dull. But behind them, something unfamiliar was starting to flicker. It wasn't sadness, not anymore. It was colder than that, sharper. Rage, yes, but something more calculated too. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to cry into a pillow or write some desperate letter asking why. No. If he thought he could throw me away like garbage and stroll in here with his shiny new wife, he was going to learn just how useful I could still be. Not to him, not anymore, but to myself. And to whatever vengeance the universe had been holding in reserve for a moment just like this. I blew out the candles one by one, slowly, deliberately, like snuffing out the last illusions I had about us. Each tiny flame vanished with a hiss, and with it, any warmth I'd been holding on to. I picked up the wine bottle and poured myself a glass, not for celebration anymore, but for clarity. The bitterness on my tongue felt appropriate. I stood there in the silence, swirling the glass in my hand, watching the light catch the deep red. I wasn't going anywhere. That house was as much mine as the air in my lungs. No, more, because I built it. I bled for it. He thought I'd be gone before he even got back. That I'd vanish quietly, like a loyal little wife who knew her time was up. But what he didn't count on was me finding my spine the second he ripped my heart out. He'd underestimated me, not just as a woman, but as his woman. The one who stood by him through every failure, every foolish dream, every dark stretch of our lives. And now he wanted to replace me like I was just a worn-out chapter? No. This wasn't the end of my story. He just handed me the pen. I walked over to the window and looked out into the driveway, imagining him pulling in. Smug, entitled, hand in hand with her. Did he think I'd crumble? That I'd leave the door unlocked and my dignity on the floor? I took a slow breath. I wasn't going to cry tonight. No, tonight I was going to plan. Because something inside me had shifted. Something unshakable. And while he was playing house with someone new, I was about to remind him exactly who built the one he's about to walk into. I couldn't sit still. My feet carried me from room to room, not really looking for anything, just tracing the edges of a life that suddenly didn't feel like mine. Every step echoed with memories I didn't ask for. The hallway where I used to wait for him to get home, still in my work clothes, still hopeful. The kitchen where I burned that awful lasagna our first year, and he laughed so hard he cried. The bedroom we painted together, arguing over paint swatches like it actually mattered. It all came flooding back, and yet, none of it felt real anymore. It felt stolen. I ran my hand along the banister, the same one I gripped when we finally got the keys. I remembered how small our savings were back then, how we scraped together the down payment with my inheritance and a little luck. He was between jobs, so I covered the bills for a while. Longer than I should have. But I didn't mind. I believed in us. I believed in him. God, I even put my own career on pause when his startup idea needed full-time attention. I became the steady one, the constant, the background music while he tried to find his melody. And now? He silenced me. Erased me. On our anniversary. I paused in front of the closet, his side still neat, just like he always kept it. I stared at his shirts, all those crisp button-downs I used to fold with care. I could still smell his cologne on the collars. It made me sick, but not weak. No, something was building inside me, something steadier than heartbreak. I wasn't about to pack his things, not because I wanted him here, but because he didn't get to write the ending. He may have chosen a new wife, but I was still the woman who built this house. And if he thought he could throw me out of it like I didn't matter, well, he had no idea who he married. I walked into the guest room next, the one we never quite finished. It still had boxes we said we'd unpack one day. Inside were pieces of me he never bothered to see. My writing notebooks, photos from my college days, the framed award I got at work that he didn't show up to see. I used to think he just forgot. But now I knew better. He didn't forget. He just didn't care. I lowered myself onto the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. How many pieces of myself had I boxed up for him? How many dreams had I shelved so his could shine? I remembered how he used to call me his rock, like it was a compliment. But rocks don't move. They don't grow. They just sit still, holding up everything else while they wear down from the weight. And I carried it all, didn't I? The bills, the moods, the disappointments. When his business failed, it was me who held his head while he cried. When he didn't get that job, it was my salary that kept us afloat. But now that his luck turned, so did his loyalty. How convenient. How perfectly timed. On the night I lit candles to celebrate us, he lit a match to burn it all down. I stood up. Enough mourning. I wasn't the one who should be grieving here. I hadn't betrayed anyone. I didn't run off into someone else's arms. I stayed. I sacrificed. I gave more than I got, and still, I was left behind. But no more. No more shrinking. No more loyalty to a man who cashed it in like a poker chip. I wouldn't leave this house like a discarded thing. I'd stay. And I'd take back every inch of space he took for granted. It was time to stop pacing. It was time to start planning. I moved back toward the dining room, the one I had set so carefully just hours earlier. The table still looked beautiful, untouched, waiting. But now it felt like a stage, and I was done playing the supporting role. I started clearing the plates, not with sadness, but with purpose. Each fork I gathered felt like a step forward. Each glass I rinsed felt like I was washing him out of my life, piece by piece. The ritual of it grounded me. It reminded me that I still had control. Not over what he did, but over what came next. As I loaded the dishwasher, an idea started forming. At first, it was just a spark, barely there. But the more I thought about it, the brighter it burned. He wanted me out of this house? Fine. But he didn't realize something crucial, something I almost forgot myself. This house was mine. Not ours. Mine. Long before we were married, before I ever said I do, this place had been in my name, bought with my own money, my inheritance, my roots. And he was just a guest who overstayed. I dried my hands and looked around, not at what was lost, but at what was left. My name, my memories, my fire. I wasn't going anywhere, not until I made sure he felt the weight of what he tried to throw away. This wasn't about winning him back. It was about reclaiming what he tried to erase. And if he thought he could waltz through that front door with another woman on his arm, well, I had news for him. That door wouldn't even open. The next morning I brewed coffee not out of habit but strategy. I sat at the kitchen table, alone, calm, no tears in sight, and opened the old filing cabinet tucked in the hallway. It took me a minute to find the folder, the one I hadn't touched in years. The deed, my name, only mine. Signed and sealed 2 years before the wedding, bought with my parents' inheritance after they passed. He never contributed a cent to this home's purchase. I stared at the paperwork like it was a lifeline, and in many ways it was. I called the lawyer I hadn't spoken to since we closed on the house. She remembered me, listened carefully as I laid it all out, the text, the timing, the so-called new wife. I half expected her to react with disbelief, but instead, she sighed. "Seen it too many times," she said. "But Mary, you have the upper hand here. Legally, emotionally, financially. We just have to move fast." And just like that, I wasn't helpless anymore. I was a woman with options. And soon, I'd be a woman with paperwork in motion. I didn't stop there. I called a locksmith, asked for an emergency rekeying, then a moving company. Not for my things, for his. "Everything from the master bedroom and the closet on the left," I told them. "No need to be delicate." I made another call, to an old friend who worked in design. "You ever redecorate a house out of spite?" I asked. She laughed. "Only twice." My voice didn't shake once that day. I had a plan now. And when a woman like me has a plan, especially one she didn't ask to make, it's best you don't get in her way. By noon, the locks had been changed. Every doorknob, every entry point. The locksmith was quick and didn't ask questions, though he gave me a look, the kind that says I've seen this before. I offered him coffee. He nodded, polite. I think he understood more than he let on. After he left, I stood in the doorway for a long while, hand resting on the cool brass handle. It felt final, like drawing a line he wouldn't be able to cross again, not without a key. And trust me, he'd never get one of those again. The movers came right after. 2 men, efficient, quiet. I pointed to his side of the closet, the drawers that held his monogrammed socks, the shelf with his leather shaving kit. They packed it all with mechanical precision, not a moment wasted. I didn't watch closely. I didn't need to. Every item they removed felt like air returning to the room. Lighter. Freer. I even let them take the leather chair he loved, the one I never really liked. Funny how that worked out. I signed the receipt and waved goodbye like I was sending off a bad habit I'd finally quit. Then came the hardest part, walking through the empty spaces that once held his things. You'd think I'd feel sad, maybe nostalgic. But honestly, I felt clean, like someone had wiped the fog off the mirror and I could finally see myself again. Not the woman who waited up late. Not the one who made excuses when he forgot my birthday. The real me. The one who once bought this house with her own 2 hands and dreams too big to be shared with someone small. The woman he misjudged and was about to deeply regret crossing. By the time the sun began to set, I was done. The house was silent again, but not in the same way as before. This silence felt earned, intentional. I sat back at the dining table, the same table I'd once set for love, and laid out the documents my lawyer had sent over. Property confirmation, notice of intent to file for divorce, a restraining clause barring him from entering the premises without permission. I signed everything in long, steady strokes. No hesitation, no tremble. It was the most powerful I'd felt in years. I printed one final note, short, firm, perfectly worded. Trespassing is a crime. This property belongs to Mary. Call your lawyer, not your ex-wife. I folded it and taped it to the front gate, right where his smug little face would see it the second he arrived. I made sure it was level, made sure it couldn't be missed. And then I stepped back inside, locked the door, and stood there for a moment, just listening to the echo of my own heartbeat. I wasn't hiding. I was preparing. Somewhere out there, he thought he was coming home, maybe even rehearsing what smug little joke he'd deliver when he opened the door with her on his arm. Maybe he thought I'd be gone, that I'd obediently vanished, like a chapter he could close. But what he didn't know was that he was no longer welcome. Not just in this house, in this story. And tomorrow, when he tried to step back into my life like it still belonged to him, he'd realize just how far I'd already written him out. The next morning, I made coffee the same way I always did. Except this time, I drank it from the living room window, in silence, in peace, watching the driveway like it was a stage. I didn't have to wait long. Around 10 a.m., his car pulled in, smooth and confident, like he still owned the world. And there he was, Daniel. Crisp polo shirt, smug expression, sunglasses perched like arrogance on his face. And beside him, holding his arm like she'd won some prize, was her. Tasha, the new wife. He stepped out first, already reaching for the gate code. I sipped my coffee. He pressed the button once, then again. I could see the confusion start to ripple across his face. He tried a few more times, tapping harder, then looked at her like maybe she was the problem. She tilted her head, clearly annoyed. I leaned slightly forward, just enough to see the moment his eyes found the paper, the notice. I imagined the words sinking in, each one like a punch to the gut. Trespassing. Property belongs to Mary. Call your lawyer. He read it twice, maybe 3 times, like he thought the words might magically change. And then came the eruption. He shouted my name, loud, sharp, performative. Tasha flinched. He marched up to the door like he still had the right, pounded on it like a child denied a toy. I didn't move, didn't blink. Let him rage. Let him pound. Let the neighbors look out their windows, their curtains barely drawn, curiosity painting their faces. I didn't care. Let him perform. This was his curtain call, and I was watching from the director's chair. He kept yelling, this time switching to pleading tones, like I'd accidentally locked him out of his own life. Mary, open the damn door. This is my house too. No, Daniel. It never was. Not on paper and not anymore in spirit. I didn't answer. I didn't even shift. Let him feel the weight of being ignored. Let him stew in the silence he thought I'd fill with apologies and second chances. Tasha stood a few steps behind him now, her arms crossed, trying to act unaffected, but her face said it all. She hadn't signed up for this. She glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the growing audience. A few neighbors had stepped outside, pretending to check their mail or water their plants. But we all knew what they were really watching. The perfect little fantasy Daniel had crafted, shattered at the front gate. Tasha whispered something to him, probably asking why he didn't have a key, why the locks were changed, why the hell his name wasn't even on the property. He snapped at her. That got her attention. Her whole body stiffened like someone slapped her with reality. I watched her take a small step back, just one. But it was enough. Enough to tell me she saw through him now. Maybe not all the way, but just enough to realize she wasn't walking into the fairy tale she'd been promised. Daniel turned back toward the house, still shouting, still pounding, as if volume could rewrite ownership. I let the curtain fall softly back into place. I'd seen enough. Let them both stay out there and feel it. The cold, the rejection, the embarrassment, the beginning of their end. I walked away from the window, slow and steady, my mug still warm in my hand. There was no rush. I didn't need to see the rest, because I already knew how it would play out. Daniel would flail, then fume, then eventually fizzle into quiet defeat. He'd dig through his phone, maybe call a lawyer, maybe call me again. I already had him blocked. Every number, every channel. And if he tried from a new one, well, I knew how to silence him now. Not with shouting, with absence. That house had echoed with so many of his moods over the years. The sulking, the cold shoulders, the self-importance that walked louder than his feet. But now, it was peaceful. My peace. And I wasn't about to let a man, any man, shatter it again. Outside, he was still knocking, still trying to make the world bend to his will. But the only sound that mattered was the one inside me. Calm, clear, resolute. I had no more apologies left to give. Just boundaries, locked doors, and a front gate that wouldn't open for betrayal. I poured myself another cup of coffee, added a splash of cream. I didn't even flinch when he shouted one last time. I knew what that yell meant. It wasn't anger anymore. It was disbelief. It was the sound of a man realizing he'd lost the upper hand, the home, and the woman who once would have forgiven everything. But not this time. This time he'd underestimated the silence. And it was that silence that told him, "You don't live here anymore." The first time I laughed again, really laughed, it was months later, sitting at that same dining table, now surrounded by women who'd known me before him, during him, and now, after. The wine flowed. The candles flickered for joy this time, not illusion. There were no place cards, no stiff expectations, just warmth, friendship, relief. And as we raised our glasses, I looked around and realized, this wasn't a comeback. This was a resurrection, and I didn't owe it to anyone but myself. The divorce was finalized quietly. No courtroom drama, no final showdown. He signed because he had no leverage left. No claim, no story to spin. I'd made sure of that. My lawyer called it a clean break. I called it a damn miracle. He tried reaching out a few times before that. First with fake apologies, then threats, then desperation. But I didn't answer. Not once. Blocking him wasn't just digital. It was spiritual. Every ignored call, every unopened message was another stitch in the wound he gave me. And slowly, I healed. I changed the locks again, not out of fear, but as a ritual, a way of saying, this is mine now, all of it. New keys for a new chapter. I painted the bedroom a warm sage green, got rid of that awful leather chair, and bought a plush sofa I could sink into without thinking about compromise. Every corner of the house became mine in a way it never had been before. And every morning I woke up without him, I felt a little more like myself. Not the version he tolerated, the version I missed, the version I finally chose. Some days I still walked past the front gate and smiled at the memory of his face. That stunned, sputtering expression when he realized the locks had changed. But not out of bitterness. Not anymore. It was just clarity. Proof of how far I'd come. That moment used to replay in my head like a revenge anthem. Now? It was just a chapter. A necessary rupture that made space for everything that followed. Healing doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it tiptoes in through a morning breeze, or the way your shoulders stop tensing at every sound. I started doing the things I once put off for him. Pottery classes on Wednesday nights, solo brunches on Sundays with a book in hand, spontaneous road trips without explaining to anyone. I wore lipstick for the hell of it, cooked only when I wanted to, and took up space in my own life like I was finally allowed to breathe. And maybe, for the first time in decades, I actually was. The quiet no longer unnerved me. It comforted me. It whispered, "You made it." Every now and then I'd hear whispers around town. That he and Tasha didn't last, that they argued, that she left. Maybe it was true. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, it wasn't my business. I didn't need his suffering to validate my strength. I'd already reclaimed more than he ever took, my voice, my time, my dignity. And that was enough. More than enough. Because I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living, fully, deeply, and unapologetically for me. The table where it all began, the one I'd once set with trembling hands and hopeful eyes, had become my favorite place in the house. Not because of what it represented back then, but because of what I reclaimed around it. I hosted dinners there now, surrounded by laughter, by stories that had nothing to do with him. No candles for romance, just light, steady and warm. I didn't flinch at anniversaries anymore. They came and went like weather. And if they meant anything now, it was only this. I made it through. That night, as my friends toasted around me, I looked down at my glass and thought about all the versions of myself I'd had to leave behind. The naive newlywed, the quiet peacemaker, the woman who waited too long for someone to change. They were all gone, not forgotten, but gently released. In their place stood someone I hadn't known in years, someone strong, certain, whole. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't overthink it. I just smiled, lifted my glass, and said the only thing that felt true. To being useful. To myself.
For 32 years, I've tended the gardens at Harrington Estate. My calloused hands have sculpted every hedge, nurtured every rare orchid in the greenhouse, and designed each seasonal display that has graced the covers of architectural magazines. The Harringtons trusted no one else with their prized botanical collection, a trust that extended only to the plants, never to the man who made them flourish. The family never bothered to learn that my name is Gabriel Mercer, not Gabe the gardener. They never discovered that the quiet man in mud-stained work clothes held 3 advanced degrees in botany and landscape architecture. Most importantly, they never suspected that I'd been systematically acquiring ownership of the land beneath their magnificent estate, piece by precious piece, for over 3 decades. I came to Harrington Estate in 1993, not seeking employment but pursuing research. My doctoral work at Cornell focused on rare ornamental species, and the Harrington collection was legendary in academic circles. I'd written to request access for my dissertation research, but received no response. The Harringtons rarely bothered with academics unless they came from suitable families. Undeterred, I applied for a groundskeeper position instead. Victor Harrington Sr., impressed by my knowledge of his rare specimens, hired me immediately. He assumed my expertise came from practical experience rather than formal education, and I never corrected him. The position offered unlimited access to one of the finest private botanical collections in the country, exactly what I needed. I intended to stay only until my research was complete. That changed the day I overheard a conversation between Victor Sr. and his attorney in the greenhouse, where they thought they were alone. The indigenous claim to the eastern parcel is nonsense, Victor was saying, examining a rare black orchid I'd coaxed into bloom. Their documentation is centuries old and mostly oral tradition. Our paperwork is properly filed with the county. The paperwork you created in 1967, the attorney reminded him gently. If anyone investigated thoroughly, no one will. Victor interrupted. We've donated enough to the Historical Society to ensure their cooperation. Besides, that land has been Harrington property for 3 generations now. Possession is 9/10 of the law. I remained motionless behind a large palm, absorbing their words. The Harringtons had apparently seized land from the Onondaga people, falsified documentation, and maintained their claim through influence and money. As the grandson of an Onondaga woman who had told me stories of lost ancestral lands, this revelation struck me like physical blow. That evening, I visited my grandmother on the reservation. I showed her a map of the Harrington estate, and her eyes filled with tears as she pointed to the eastern woodlands. Our sacred springs, she whispered, where our people gathered for centuries before the Europeans came. My brief research position transformed into a mission spanning decades. I continued working as head gardener, earning Victor Sr.'s complete trust with my botanical expertise. When he died in 2001, his son Victor Jr. inherited the estate and retained my services, though he had little interest in the gardens beyond their value in impressing business associates. Meanwhile, I began my careful, methodical plan. I lived simply in the gardener's cottage provided by the Harringtons, saving most of my salary. I completed my doctorate through evening and weekend work, publishing under a different name to avoid attracting the Harringtons' attention. When my grandmother passed away, she left me her modest savings, which I dedicated entirely to my cause. The first opportunity came in 2005, when a 5-acre parcel adjoining the eastern edge of the estate went into foreclosure. Though officially listed as separate from Harrington land, I recognized it from my grandmother's descriptions as part of the original contested territory. I purchased it through a shell company created with the help of a lawyer friend from the reservation. Victor Jr. never noticed. The land was wooded and undeveloped, irrelevant to his business interests. I continued maintaining his gardens while quietly investigating the complex history of the property's boundaries. What I discovered was a patchwork of questionable acquisitions. The original Harrington estate had been much smaller, expanded through decades of strategic purchases, many conducted under ethically dubious circumstances during periods of economic hardship. Most crucially, I learned that the estate wasn't a single property but a collection of adjoining parcels with separate deeds, some of which had never been properly consolidated. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, Victor Jr. faced substantial losses. Though the Harringtons remained wealthy, their cash flow suffered. Victor began selling off peripheral parcels of the estate to maintain his lavish lifestyle without liquidating his more valuable investments. These sales created my opportunity. Working through various shell companies and indigenous community investment trusts, I purchased 3 key parcels between 2009 and 2012. Victor never connected these transactions to his gardener. The purchases were handled by attorneys, and the buying entities appeared unrelated. By 2015, I controlled nearly 40% of what had once been Harrington land, including the eastern woodland with the sacred springs. Yet my most significant acquisition came unexpectedly. Victor Jr. had a gambling problem, one he kept hidden from his family and business associates. During a weekend in Monaco in 2017, he accumulated substantial debts to the wrong people. Desperate for quick cash, he secretly sold the heart of the estate, the 20 acres containing the main house, formal gardens, and greenhouse complex, to a private equity firm, with a leaseback agreement allowing him to continue residing there while maintaining appearances. When that private equity firm faced bankruptcy in 2020, I was waiting. Through careful financial maneuvering and the support of several indigenous investment cooperatives, I acquired the central property at auction. The transaction was complex enough that Victor never realized who now held his mortgage. For the next 5 years, I continued as the Harrington gardener, watching Victor's finances deteriorate further. His leaseback payments became increasingly delayed. He began selling art and antiques to maintain the illusion of wealth. But the gardens, my gardens, remained immaculate. Featured regularly in luxury magazines that paid substantial licensing fees, which now came to my management companies rather than to Victor. The final act began when Victor announced plans to host an extravagant gala celebrating the Harrington family's 150 years of distinguished ownership of the estate. The event would feature prominent politicians, celebrities, and business leaders. It would also serve as the announcement of Victor's most ambitious plan, converting part of the sacred eastern woodland into an exclusive members-only golf course. Construction equipment arrived the week before the gala, The operators presented permits and authorizations bearing Victor's signature. I watched from the greenhouse as they approached the ancient trees at the woodland's edge. Then I made a phone call. Within 30 minutes, tribal representatives arrived with local law enforcement and court-ordered injunctions. The construction crews were instructed to vacate immediately. A confused Victor came storming across the lawn, demanding explanations. "This is private property," he shouted at the tribal attorney. "I have every right to develop my land." "Actually, Mr. Harrington," the attorney replied calmly, "this parcel hasn't been your property since 2011. It belongs to the Onondaga Nation Land Reclamation Trust." Victor's face flushed crimson. "That's absurd. My family has owned this entire estate for generations." I chose that moment to step forward, removing my work gloves. "Not anymore, Victor." He barely glanced at me. "Gabe, call our attorneys immediately. These people are trespassing." "My name is Dr. Gabriel Mercer," I said quietly, "and they're not trespassing. I invited them." Something in my tone finally captured his full attention. He looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in 20 years. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. The tribal attorney handed him a thick folder of legal documents. "These papers detail the current ownership of what you call Harrington Estate," she explained. "The eastern woodland belongs to the Onondaga Nation. The remaining parcels, including the main house where you reside, belong to various entities controlled by Dr. Mercer." Victor flipped through the papers, his hands shaking. "This isn't possible," he whispered. "You've been making lease payments to my company for 5 years, Victor," I said. "Those payments are now 12 months in arrears. I've been patient, but your announced development plan has forced my hand." The color drained from his face. "You're evicting me? Before my gala?" "The gala can proceed," I said. "In fact, I insist upon it. The guest list includes numerous individuals who should witness what I'm about to announce." The following Saturday, Harrington Estate was transformed for the gala. Hundreds of guests in formal attire wandered the gardens I had perfected over decades. String quartets played on the terraces. Champagne flowed freely, though not at Victor's expense. I had personally covered the costs after his credit was declined by the caterers. At precisely 9 o'clock, Victor clinked his glass for attention, somehow maintaining his practiced smile despite the catastrophe unfolding in his life. He welcomed everyone to the historic Harrington Estate and began a self-congratulatory speech about his family's legacy of stewardship. I waited until he mentioned the planned golf course development before stepping onto the small stage. The microphone was easily relinquished by the confused Victor when several tribal elders joined me. "Distinguished guests," I began, "my name is Dr. Gabriel Mercer. For 32 years, I've been introduced at events like this, when I was acknowledged at all, as the gardener. Tonight, I'm speaking to you as the principal owner of what will now be called Ganondagan Gardens, a cooperative cultural and botanical preservation project." The crowd murmured in confusion. Victor attempted to reclaim the microphone, but security, no longer in his employ, gently restrained him. I continued, "The eastern woodland of this property contains springs sacred to the Onondaga people. That land has now been returned to its rightful stewards. The main estate will become a public botanical garden and indigenous cultural center, open to all visitors rather than just the privileged few." As comprehension dawned on the assembled guests, Victor finally lost his composure. "He was my gardener," he shouted. "Just the gardener." I met his gaze calmly. "I was never just your gardener, Victor. I was the caretaker of something far more valuable than you realized. While you saw only status symbols and development opportunities, I saw living history and cultural heritage worth preserving." In the stunned silence that followed, I invited the tribal elders to speak. They shared brief stories of their ancestral connection to the land, stories my grandmother had once shared with me. When they finished, I announced that the formal gardens and greenhouse collections would be preserved under expert care, including educational programs for underserved communities. As the guests departed, whispering among themselves about the evening's dramatic revelations, Victor remained on the terrace, staring vacantly at the gardens that had never truly belonged to him. "You have 2 weeks to vacate the premises," I informed him quietly. "I've arranged temporary housing for you in the village. It's modest but comfortable." 32 years, he murmured, finally comprehending the scope of what had happened. "You worked for my family for 32 years just to take our land?" "Not to take it," I corrected him, "to return it. There's a difference that your grandfather never understood when he falsified those documents in 1967. Victor looked up sharply. "You knew about that?" "I knew everything, Victor. Your family saw only the gardener's clothes, never the man wearing them. That was your mistake." The following morning, I walked the grounds at dawn, as I had done every day for 3 decades. The dew-covered roses, the precisely trimmed hedges, the rare specimens in the greenhouse, all exactly as they should be. For the first time, I entered the main house through the front door rather than the service entrance. In the grand entrance hall, I passed the portrait of Victor Harrington Sr., his imperious gaze now seeming less confident. Perhaps he understood now, wherever he was, that ownership isn't about papers filed in county offices or names engraved on silver markers. True ownership comes from connection, from care, from the patient nurturing of something greater than oneself. I opened the French doors and stepped onto the main terrace, surveying the gardens that had been my life's work. Soon, these paths would be filled with visitors of all backgrounds. Children from the reservation would learn about their ancestral plants. Botanical researchers would have full access to the collections. As the morning sun illuminated the greenhouse glass, I smiled at the irony that had apparently escaped 3 generations of Harringtons. They had paid me, decade after decade, to nurture the very evidence of their fraudulent claim. Every ancient tree I preserved, every heirloom plant I propagated, strengthened the case for the land's original stewardship. The Harringtons had always believed that wealth meant never having to look closely at those who served them. They never imagined that the man in soil-stained clothes, invisible despite being in plain sight for 32 years, would be the architect of their downfall and the guardian of something far more precious than their family name. For 65 years, I brought Raymond Hayes his morning coffee, black, no sugar, served in the same bone china cup with the gold rim, the one his father used before him. As personal assistant to the chairman of Hayes Financial Group, I've maintained a careful routine: arrive at 6:30 a.m., prepare his office, organize his schedule, and ensure everything runs with military precision. What Mr. Hayes doesn't know is that I control 51% of his company's voting shares. My name is Eleanor Blackwood, though everyone at Hayes Financial knows me only as MS. Eleanor, the impeccably dressed elderly assistant who has been a fixture at the company longer than most employees have been alive. I joined Hayes Financial in 1960, not as an assistant but as a financial analyst with a mathematics degree from Radcliffe College. I was the only woman in the department, hired during a moment of progressive thinking by Raymond's father, William Hayes. I had a gift for spotting investment opportunities that others missed, identifying market patterns through statistical analysis decades before computers made such work commonplace. William valued my insights, though he kept my contributions quiet. The clients aren't ready for a woman's advice on their money, he'd explain apologetically. I accepted this arrangement, grateful for meaningful work when most of my college classmates had become homemakers after brief teaching careers. When William died suddenly in 1975, his son Raymond, fresh from Harvard Business School with more ambition than experience, took control. I expected changes but not the betrayal that followed. One evening, as I was finishing a comprehensive analysis of emerging technology companies, Raymond called me into his office. He was seated with 2 board members, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Eleanor, we're restructuring the analysis department," he announced. "We're bringing in a team from Boston with computer modeling expertise. I'm afraid your position has become obsolete." I knew immediately what had happened. Raymond had discovered my confidential work for his father, investment strategies that had quietly tripled the firm's value over 15 years. He wanted that success attributed solely to Hayes' leadership. "Of course, your loyalty deserves recognition," Raymond continued, sliding a document across the desk. "Father left instructions for you to receive a small stake in the company, 1%. Generous, considering." He didn't finish the sentence, but his implication was clear. "Considering you're just a woman who should be grateful for any acknowledgement." The betrayal stung, but I maintained my composure. William had actually promised me much more: recognition as a full partner after his retirement. But he died before putting everything in writing, leaving only informal notes that Raymond had clearly discovered and decided to interpret minimally. I signed the document, accepting the insultingly small stake while hiding my devastation. The next morning, I returned to Hayes Financial with a different proposal. "I understand your decision regarding my analyst position," I told Raymond, "but your father always said organization was the backbone of this business. Perhaps I could serve as your personal assistant? No one knows the firm's operations as I do." Raymond seemed relieved by my lack of bitterness and agreed immediately. He assumed I was a spinster who needed the job, grateful for any role. He never questioned why someone with my qualifications would accept such a demotion. Thus began my second career at Hayes Financial, and my patient journey toward justice. For the next 45 years, I became indispensable to Raymond. I maintained his schedule, prepared his meetings, and frequently ghostwrote his correspondence and speeches. From my modest desk outside his office, I observed everything: client relationships, investment decisions, personnel changes, and most importantly, Raymond's mistakes. Meanwhile, I began my careful acquisition strategy. My 1% stake provided quarterly dividends, which I reinvested entirely in Hayes Financial shares whenever the price dipped. I lived modestly in the same one-bedroom apartment I'd rented since 1963, spending little on myself beyond my impeccably tailored suits and sensible pearls. When Hayes Financial went public in 1982, I created a web of small investment entities through distant relatives and college connections, allowing me to acquire shares without triggering disclosure requirements. Raymond never questioned how I understood complex SEC regulations so thoroughly. He simply appreciated having an assistant who could explain them without bothering him with details. The 1987 market crash created my first major opportunity. Hayes Financial stock plummeted, and Raymond panicked. I calmly helped him craft communication to reassure clients while secretly leveraging my savings to purchase significant blocks of devalued shares. Similar opportunities arose during the 2000 tech bubble burst, the 2008 financial crisis, and various smaller market corrections. Through it all, Raymond saw me as nothing more than his faithful assistant, reliable, intelligent enough to be useful, but fundamentally decorative. He failed to notice that I never retired. Even as I approached my 80s, he didn't question why I remained so engaged with company operations when I could have been enjoying grandchildren, had I any, or traveling the world. The truth was that Hayes Financial had become my life's work, not serving Raymond, but patiently reclaiming what should have been mine decades ago. By 2023, at age 85, my various investment vehicles controlled 49% of Hayes Financial voting shares. Raymond, now 74, still owned 26% himself, with the remainder distributed among other investors. He began discussing retirement, planning to install his son Bradley as chairman despite the younger Hayes' obvious incompetence and ethical flexibility. That's when Providence delivered my final opportunity. Hayes Financial faced a potential merger with Atlantic Capital Partners, a larger firm seeking to absorb our excellent reputation and client list. The merger required a shareholder vote, with 2/3 majority needed for approval. Raymond desperately wanted this merger. It would allow him to cash out with a generous golden parachute while placing Bradley in a prominent but largely ceremonial role in the new organization. He spent weeks courting major shareholders, confident that his own 26% combined with management's recommendations would secure the necessary votes. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for May 15, 2025. As always, I arranged everything: the conference room, the catering, the presentation materials. Raymond spent the morning reviewing his remarks, certain of victory. At precisely 10 a.m., I entered his office with his coffee, black, no sugar, bone china cup with the gold rim. The meeting begins in 30 minutes, Mr. Hayes, I said, placing the cup on his perfectly arranged desk. Thank you, Eleanor, he replied absently, scanning his notes. Has Bradley arrived yet? He's in the lobby, sir. Before he comes up, there's something you should know about the shareholder vote. Raymond glanced up, mildly curious. Is there a problem? I smiled, enjoying the moment I had awaited for half a century. It depends on your perspective, sir. I've taken the liberty of contacting major shareholders regarding today's vote. You did what? His casual tone sharpened instantly. I've been discussing the merger with Westfield Investments, Barton Holdings, Sheffield Trust, and Lakewood Partners. They collectively hold 25% of voting shares, and they've agreed to vote against the merger. Raymond's face flushed. Those are my contacts. Eleanor, what gives you the right to interfere, and why would they listen to my assistant? Perhaps because I also represent Phoenix Capital Group, I said calmly. We control 26% of Hayes Financial shares, and we're also voting against the merger. Raymond stared at me, confusion evident. Phoenix Capital? I've never heard of. It's one of several investment vehicles I've established over the years, I explained, sitting down uninvited across from him. Combined with my personal holdings and proxy agreements, I control 51% of Hayes Financial voting shares. The merger will not be proceeding. The shock on Raymond's face was everything I had imagined during 65 years of patient waiting. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally managed, "That's impossible. You're my assistant." "I was never just your assistant, Raymond. I was your father's most trusted advisor. I built the investment strategies that made this firm successful. Strategies you claimed as your own. When you pushed me aside 50 years ago, you thought you were dealing with a woman who would accept whatever crumbs you offered. You were wrong." He stood abruptly, knocking over the coffee cup. The dark liquid spread across his pristine desk, staining his merger documents. "This is preposterous. You can't possibly. We'll contest this. The board will never. The board will do what the majority shareholder directs." I interrupted gently. "As of this morning, I've informed them of my position and my intentions. Unlike you, I built relationships with every board member over decades. They understand that I know this business better than anyone alive." Raymond collapsed back into his chair, his face ashen. "What do you want?" I smiled. "Exactly what your father promised me 50 years ago, recognition for my work and control of the company I helped build. Effective immediately, I'll be assuming the chairmanship of Hayes Financial Group." "You're 85 years old," he sputtered. "You can't run a financial firm at your age." "I've been running it from behind your desk for decades," I replied. "The only difference now is that I'll be sitting on the correct side." The shareholder meeting that day was brief but dramatic. I announced my majority position, the termination of merger discussions, and my immediate installation as chairwoman. Raymond resigned on the spot, his carefully constructed legacy collapsing around him. As he cleared out his office, I watched from what was now my doorway. He looked suddenly old and diminished, struggling to understand how his faithful assistant had orchestrated his downfall. 65 years, he finally said, looking up at me. "You spent 65 years as my assistant just to take revenge?" I shook my head. "Not revenge, Raymond, justice. I spent 65 years building and protecting this company while you took the credit. Now I'm simply claiming what I earned." He left without another word, shoulders slumped under the weight of his miscalculation. The next morning, I arrived at 6:30 a.m. as always, but walked past my old desk to the chairman's office, my office now. The desk had been cleaned, all traces of yesterday's spilled coffee removed. I placed my own cup down, black, no sugar, in a modern mug with the company's new logo, which I had designed myself decades ago. I looked out over the Manhattan skyline as the rising sun illuminated the financial district. Hayes Financial, soon to be renamed Blackwood Financial Group, would announce a new direction today. Our first initiative, a scholarship and mentorship program for women in finance, ensuring no one else would wait 65 years for recognition. Sometimes, I reflected, the most powerful person in the room isn't the one behind the biggest desk, but the one who understands that true power comes from patience, preparation, and persistence. Raymond Hayes never understood that, but I had all the time in the world to teach him.